Hello, you lovely internet people. We've got Black Ops 2 gameplay, but aside from that, this is part 2 of a series of videos about getting into PC building rather than buying from your retail brands. But again, one of my last parts will probably be about the good retail brands. But aside from that, let's talk about computer components, because this is going to be a long one, because there's, as I said, there's a huge variety of computer components, but at the same time it can be overwhelming. So I'm going to go through all the components, and then throughout the series I'll be talking about buyer's guides for these different things. They'll probably get outdated, but still. So first up, you have your CPU, also known as the Central Processing Unit, which is basically the brains of the computer. It controls everything about your computer. It controls I don't know what else to say. It's just like your human brain. Your human brain sends signals to everything else, telling it to do stuff. And then, next, you have your CPU cooler. Now, most CPUs come with a stock cooler. But, so, if most come with a stock cooler, people are wondering, why would you buy an external cooler? An external cooler is better because most of them are just blatantly better for CPU cooling, because the better your CPU temperatures are, the longer the lifespan will be for that CPU. But it can't be super low, because if it's too low, then you get condensation, which is water. And water and electronics do not mix well at all. So remember that. So for CPU coolers, you have air coolers, which cool the CPU via a heat sink and a fan. So you could just use the heat sink by itself, but you also want a fan usually. Most CPU coolers should come with thermal paste, but I still recommend buying your other thermal compound. Just research good thermal compounds, and you'll find some for about $5 at most, usually $3. Okay. And then another type of CPU cooler, you have your water coolers. Now I know I said water and CPU and electronics don't mix well together, but water coolers use a water block, as in the water is stored inside the block. So the block itself is cold, and the block is on top of the CPU, which thereby cools the CPU because the block has the cool water in it. So most of your... Also, the block does need thermal compound. So remember that. Most come with thermal compound, but I don't know, you may want to take it off. Oh, also be sure to have... no, I'm not going to talk about it right now. I'll talk about that later. Okay, so that's water cooling. Your water coolers come with a radiator, a pump, and a CPU block. I'll show pictures of these things, hopefully, if I remember. So, I'll show pictures of the different components. Well, they're not all the same, but I'll show an example. So, next up you have your motherboard. Now, your motherboard is basically the bridge to everything else. So, motherboard is the first thing you install. Wait, no, it's not the first thing you install. But you install every component onto the motherboard. Your CPU goes inside the motherboard. Your RAM goes inside the motherboard. Your storage, although it gets connected to the motherboard via a SATA cable or some other type of cable. There are other ways, but basically everything connects to the motherboard. Okay, next we have your RAM, random access memory, which is used by your different computer processes. So every time you open up any application, it will become a process on your on your OS. The process is run by your CPU, but the process also uses RAM, which is memory that it uses. It's very hard to explain RAM, so I recommend looking at videos on the deeper meaning of what RAM is, because it is difficult for me to explain. But you do definitely need RAM in your computer. Next, you have yourself your storage. Now, there are 3 main types of storage drives right now. So, you've got your hard disk drive, also known as an HDD, which is that huge drive you'll see most of the time with the little disk in it and all that other weird circuitry and whatnot. Now these HDDs have RPM speeds usually you'll see RPM speeds between 5400 and 7200. The higher the RPM speed, the faster the data transfer speeds are, like your read and write speeds. How fast your application will open and how fast you can download an application. But download speeds are always reliant on your, how do I explain? Oh, and write speeds are how fast you can copy something onto your drive. As in, put some application onto your drive. Okay, then hard disk drives have the highest capacity right now. So you can get a terabyte hard disk drive for around $50, and then 2 terabytes, $100 or a little bit less, and then it goes on from there. Then you have your solid state drives. Solid state drives have faster read and write speeds than a hard disk drive, meaning that you can open up applications very fast. You can boot up your system very quickly, within seconds even. Always fast SSDs. Much faster than your typical hard disk drive. And then we have an in-between, which is a solid-state hybrid drive. Now, a solid-state hybrid drive has similar performance to an SSD with a higher capacity, but the downside is that it's not as fast as an SSD is, and it's a bit more expensive than a hard disk drive. So an SSHD is an in-between. So if you can't afford an SSD, but you can afford a little more than a hard drive, then go with an SSHD, because they're usually going to be better for read and write speeds, if you care about that, with also your high-end hard drive capacities. Like, you can get a terabyte drive for around $80 nowadays. And I don't know why I'm talking about prices right now, because prices fluctuate all the time in this PC status. One day SSDs will be the standard. That could be today for you. Wouldn't that be fantastic? But not today yet. Next up, we have your video card. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because you don't need a video card. Remember that. You don't need a video card as long as your CPU has integrated graphics. Now remember that. Integrated graphics, meaning that when you're buying your CPU, if you see whether it has integrated graphics, if it says no, then you'll need a video card. If it says yes, then you don't need a video card. Now, the reason why you'd want a video card, even if you have integrated graphics, is because that's where the bulk of your gaming performance comes from. So if you're a PC, if you're a gamer, if you want to be a PC gamer, then you'll want a video card, because video cards are the bulk of your gaming performance. It's how you get your smooth 60 FPS ultra settings gameplay, all that stuff, max settings, all that good stuff. Integrated graphics are not good enough for that yet. Now remember that integrated graphics are not good enough for gaming. They can be good enough for gaming, but they're not great for gaming. They're great for sorta kinda entry level gaming, but they're not good enough for your hardcore games like Battlefield 4 or what other games are super intensive today? I don't even know, but even the most intensive games usually require some type. Even the least intensive games, the least intensive AAA titles usually suggest that you have a graphics card. The recommended settings always suggest that you have a graphics card. Now, that's video cards. There's two types of video cards you can go from. There is AMD and there is NVIDIA. Now, I'll talk about that later because those are just the two main companies. And I forgot to tell you, CPU companies, AMD, Intel. You've probably heard of those before whenever you see the little jingle. Well, not jingle. I don't know what to call it, but you know how the Intel sound goes. Okay, what else? Next up, you have your case. Your case houses all your components. There's nothing else to say about a case. It houses all your components. Sometimes it has I/O on the front, as in and out, as in sometimes it has USBs on the outside. Sometimes it has your headphone jacks and microphone jacks. But those all connect to your motherboard. Remember, motherboard is where everything is connected. Now, next you have your power supply, which is, it powers everything. You don't want to cheap out on your power supply. Because if you have a power supply that uses less wattage than your PC is using, I think it could potentially, I forget whether it could potentially explode, but it could be really bad. Just don't do it because I think it could potentially explode. Maybe. I don't know. There's some way that power supplies can explode, and I think that might be one of them. But anyway, if you want to see how much power you're going to be using, you use power calculators. Just look up power supply calculator, PC power supply calculator, and you'll probably find one. I recommend the one from Cooler Master, or I don't know what other ones there are. I forget what the other one's called. There's really specific ones out there, but just look for one of those, and then you put in every single component you're using, whether you're overclocking or not, all that other stuff. I won't talk about overclocking and stuff. I don't want to put in more factors, but you just put in all the components you're using, and then it'll recommend a power supply to be using. You usually want to be a little bit above. Actually, it's okay to be above how much power you're using. It's okay. Just as long as you're not doing stupid things like 1,000 watt power supply just for 400 watts of whatever you're doing. That's just stupid. Next, there are optical drives. An optical drive is your CD drive. Now, you have a choice between CD writer. CD reader. Okay, so you can have a CD reading drive, a CD read and write drive. You can have a Blu-ray drive, which is read. You can have a reading CD Blu-ray drive, which will also read CDs. And then you have read and write Blu-ray drive, which is basically everything you can possibly do. Now, the thing about optical drives is that they're sort of kind of optional nowadays. Even if you're installing your OS, you know how OSs normally come in a disk, but you can actually install your OS via a USB nowadays. You can just look up how to install using USB drive rather. So then you don't need an optical drive, because optical drives are really unneeded unless you are a huge video fanatic and you just have a bunch of discs of video that you really want to watch. But if you're at that point, then I recommend just getting an external USB optical drive rather. Now, next is your operating system, which is Windows, Linux, Mac OS. So, those are the main ones. There's also Steam OS and whatnot, but if you're making a Steam box, then you probably know what you're doing when it comes to building a PC. Now, the main one for gaming, obviously, Windows. Linux is okay for gaming, but if you're using Linux, then you're probably using a Steam box. Okay, Linux, good for coding, development. Linux is also good for servers, but again, if you're watching a video like this, you probably are looking for a gaming computer. So gaming computers, Windows. The latest Windows out right now, I can't really tell you that. Never mind. I'm not going to tell you the latest Windows out right now because that would just be stupid. Just get whatever the latest Windows is. Don't even think about it, because you shouldn't have to worry. Okay, next we have ourselves the peripherals, which is your keyboard. Now, we all know what a keyboard is. If you don't know what a keyboard is, look it up on the internet. Your mouse. We all know what a mouse is. There are gaming mice and keyboards, but if you're looking at gaming mice and keyboards, I would recommend looking elsewhere about that, because I do not own any gaming mice or keyboards, so I can't make a recommendation on that. So, next in peripherals is headphones. If you're an audio fanatic, then you already have headphones. You already have decent headphones. As long as you have a 3.5 millimeter jack on your headphones, then you are perfectly fine in terms of your headphones listening, audio, and whatnot. It's just like any other thing. Everybody has headphones. Pretty much everyone has headphones. And then speakers. Speakers, we get it. It's the same as headphones, except for it works more not on top of your ear. We know how speakers work. Never mind. And then your final peripheral is a monitor, because you need a monitor for a computer. If you don't have a monitor for your computer, the computer cannot display anything that you're doing. Remember that. Monitors are easy to come by. You can either get a cheapo, not even HD monitor, or you can get, I recommend if you're going into gaming, get a 1080p monitor. Most 1080p monitors are 60 Hz. Just make sure that it's 60 Hz, because if it's not 60 Hz, then you can't get 60 FPS. Remember that. I'm pretty sure, unless you're being a huge cheapskate, then every monitor you find should be 60 Hz 1080p, unless you're trying to look for something lower than that. But most monitors are 60 Hz. If they're really... Okay, next we have expansion cards, which is your sound cards. Now, sound cards are not that necessary unless you really are into doing sound. I don't know what. If you're really into sound creations, if you want to make some type of music studio or something, sound is also very good. But most of the times, the onboard sound cards on your motherboard are usually sufficient for whatever you're doing. If you want to learn more about sound cards, I recommend looking up a video on that, because my knowledge of sound cards is not that high. And then another expansion card is a wireless adapter, because unless you buy a motherboard that has its own wireless antenna built into it, then you cannot get a wireless internet connection. You could only do a wired internet connection via an Ethernet port. But considering that a lot of people don't have that type of option of doing a wired connection, I recommend wired connections over wireless connections all the time, but we won't talk about that right now. So there are wireless adapters that plug into your PCIe port in order to get your wireless connection to the internet. There you go. You just look up wireless adapter, and then you'll find it. Now, last but not least, if you don't know where to start for looking for PC components, I recommend the site PCPartPicker.com. PCPartPicker.com. Now, on that website, you can choose all the components to your heart's content, and in the next part of this video, I'll be explaining buyer's guides on how to look for these different components. Now, that is all for this video. Bye.